My name is Greg Lisby. I am the chair of the Department of Communication at Georgia State University, and I'm a professor of communication here. I grew up in Columbus, Georgia. I grew up in the town that Julian Harris used as the backdrop for his crusades in the 1920s against the Klan, in favor of teaching evolution in schools, against bigotry, against racism. You name it, Julian Harris was a major progressive journalist at that time. I'm an expert on this, I guess I'd say, because in addition to growing up in Columbus, which is where Julian Harris was, except I will freely confess it was many years between when he was there and when I grew up there, my father was also the editor of the Columbus Ledger for many, many years. And I remember going to the Columbus Ledger newsroom as a young man and seeing the Pulitzer certificate on the wall for the Columbus Ledger, the afternoon paper that won the Pulitzer Prize for public service in 1955 for its campaign involving the Phoenix City cleanup, involving civic corruption, law enforcement, bigotry, and so forth in Phoenix City, Alabama at that time. And I remember seeing that certificate and always being really impressed that my dad worked for a newspaper that had won the Pulitzer Prize. And one day I remember him asking me, he said, did you know that the morning paper, the Columbus Inquirer, also won the Pulitzer Prize? And at that time I thought, no, I didn't. And that was just all of a sudden a major interest to me to find out, did they win, what they won for and so forth. And especially at that time I thought, I wonder how many newspapers across the United States have won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for the morning paper and one for the afternoon paper. Both those topics intrigued me. So I was very fortunate to have access to the newspaper library at the Ledger Inquirer at that time. I was very fortunate to find early on that the Harrises had left their personal papers at Emory University in the Julian and Julia Harris collection there. And I was very fortunate also to find several, and I think about 12 people in Columbus at that time who actually remembered the Harrises. Now, at that time, this research actually started for me back in 1974. And so you can imagine it's been going on for some time. And at that time, the Harrises had really not been deceased all that long. Julian Harris died in 1963, and Julia died in 1967. And so many of the people that I talked to were not, well, in some cases they were 10, 20 years younger than them, but in several cases they were young people who knew the Harrises when they themselves were in their teens and the Harrises were in their 60s or 70s. And so it became an interesting discussion as to what you thought about the Harrises, what you knew about the Harrises, and so forth. So anyway, there's your sort of introduction to this. Julian Harris was the oldest child of Joel Chandler Harris, oldest of 9 children of Joel Chandler Harris. Joel Chandler Harris at that time, back in the late 1800s, had already made a name for himself, not just as a newspaper columnist for the Atlanta newspapers, but also as a folklorist who used folklore tales from Africa involving the tar baby and Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit and retold them, and was a huge popular writing success at that time. Julian Harris wanted to be just like his father. He wanted to be a journalist. His father did not want him to be a journalist, and you might imagine that there are several reasons for that. Julian's memory of what his father actually wanted was that Julian remembered that his father wanted him to be a lawyer. And Julian thought that was the worst. He thought there would be no career that he would hate more than being a lawyer. And he really sort of worked up his nerve to sort of tell his father that he didn't want to be a lawyer. When one morning his father was supposed to come in to breakfast, and his father always asked him what was in the news that morning, and he would say, something about this event or that event. And then his father that morning particularly said something along the lines of, not much of interest to a young man who wants to be a journalist. And that so caught Julian off guard, he sort of went mute for a few minutes. And his father continued and said, I hope you'll consider giving the law a chance before you make your final decision. Now, let's remember a couple things here. Number one, the final decision, Julian Harris was 16. He was 16 years old and getting ready to commit himself to a career for the rest of his life. And so today we would call that substantially young. At that point, it was not. Julian Harris also did not want to go to college, did not want to go to college, did not want to go to college. And his father thought that that would be some usefulness to him. And Julian's argument was that it was too expensive. But then he used the same argument with his father about why he should not go into law, because going to law school was too expensive. And his father said, well, you could apprentice with somebody, and oh, that's too expensive, and that's too long to train before you actually get into your career. And so in many ways, Julian had his mind made up. Whether or not his father really wanted him to go into the law or not is an interesting question. But many, many years later, when Julian was in his 70s, he began writing his autobiography, a book that he never completed. But the earliest chapter of the autobiography was a chapter that he titled Threatened by the Law. And so clearly Julian viewed that suggestion of his father as something frightening, something that he did not want to do in the slightest. When he finally sort of did his own thing, which Julian really did a lot because he was very stubborn, very independent-minded. When he finally began doing his own thing, he began working as a journalist for one of the Atlanta newspapers. I believe it was the Atlanta News at that particular time. And very quickly, within just a couple of years, worked his way up very quickly because of his expertise and the information that his father had taught him, that he had learned from his father about being a journalist here. And so about this time, somewhere late teens, early 20s, he meets a young woman named Julia Collier. And Julia Collier is the daughter of a former mayor of Atlanta. Her bloodline goes all the way back to the Rawsons on the Mayflower, and so she was considered everything Julian was not. She was considered sort of old, traditional American. Julian was sort of an upstart American. His family, of course, is Scot-Irish, but his father never knew his father. Joel Chandler Harris never knew his father. And so in many ways, Joel Chandler Harris was sort of a newly made man. And so you can imagine that his sons decide they want to do things, that just do everything they possibly can to succeed in life. Now, Julian, because he didn't want to be a lawyer, but he also was real aware of the old adage that the sons of famous men never amount to much. And he was frightened of that also. And so he began doing some reading and some research, so he was ready and able to counter that argument with his father. And certainly, if you know your history, the two father and son pairs that he came up with, first from the Roman Empire history, was Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, an uncle and nephew pair who were Roman statesmen for many, many years and highly respected at that time. The second pair he came up with was indeed a father-son pair of William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt, both of them, of course, were prime ministers of Great Britain for a period of time. And so Julian was trying to use these as his justification for saying that he could be a journalist just like his father and not be overwhelmed by his father's shadow. It is worth noting that one of Julian's best friends during that period of age 16 to 20, was a young man by the name of Henry Grady Jr. And Henry Grady Jr., if you understand your history, did not go into journalism and therefore did not choose to compete with the reputation of Henry Grady in Atlanta news circles. All right, let's see here. Once Julian becomes a well-known journalist in the early 1900s, he finds that he tires very quickly of journalism. And he tires very quickly of journalism because he finds that journalism does not offer him the independence that he wants. He's always working for someone else. and therefore beholden to someone else's interest. And he's always having to do what someone else wants him to do and what someone else actually requires him to do as a condition of being paid by someone else. And so the first thing he tries in about 1906, and I may have the date a little wrong there, was he and his father developed a magazine called the Uncle Remus magazine. And this was the first time he had an opportunity that his father became editor, he became publisher, business manager. And the magazine did not last very long. And there's all sorts of speculation as to why. But it does seem that starting a new magazine sort of from scratch was a very difficult thing to do. And so he learned early on some of his lessons about failing in the business because he didn't have the resources, didn't have the circulation. His father also passed away not too long thereafter, and so Julian sort of finishes up that decade, the first decade of the 20th century, sort of looking for a place to go and what to do. As I mentioned earlier, he was married to Julia Collier, and he and Julia Collier Harris became well known as journalists in their own right, who were really very equally yoked. They were very, very well balanced for each other. They had two sons, two baby boys, both of whom died by the age of 3. And there are many people who speculate that the deaths of their sons really dramatically affected Mrs. Harris's health over the years later, but also perhaps affected the way each of them viewed the world and what they wanted to do in the world and such like that. And so really when the early teens come in, Julian decides to go to New York, and he works for a time on the New York Herald. He then is talked into moving to Paris and works on the Paris Herald with James Gordon Bennett Jr. at that particular point. And so throughout the 19 teens, he is a writer, an editor, an advertising manager. He does several different tasks for the Paris Herald, and that, for that matter, they live in Paris for a while. In some ways, you might imagine that this is serendipitous, right place in the right time, because as the teens continue going, the main thing we start have happening, of course, is the coming of World War I. And they were in Paris or in London during that period, and actually when the war was over with, returned to Paris to cover the peace talks. Now, during that period, Julian, of course, joined the Army and did his military service and came back to do the peace talks and was really looking for a great opportunity. He was thinking he had really proven himself to James Gordon Bennett, and that this was his real opportunity to sort of be allowed to just do what he wants to do with the New York Herald, I believe. I'm going to get it wrong here in a minute. I know I am. But Bennett just doesn't want to do that. He has a Sunday committee that he wants to be in charge. He doesn't want to let Harris in charge. And so finally the Harrises say enough of this. And so they quit the New York Herald, they quit James Gordon Bennett, and they come back to Georgia. Now, many people have said that Joel Chandler Harris's reputation in Georgia, because Joel Chandler Harris was very highly respected and loved to the extent that a writer can be loved, that Joel Chandler Harris's reputation was a perfect entree into Southern journalism. And Julian Harris used that. He bought part interest in the Columbus Enquirer-Sun in Columbus, Georgia. He bought the part interest with Thomas Loyalist, who was the other part owner of that paper. And Loyalist was the editor, and Julian Harris was the business manager during that period of time. Thomas Loyalist was from Augusta. He also owned a hotel in Warm Springs, Georgia. And so Thomas Loyalist and Julian Harris began the beginnings of this incredible experiment that Julian really is more known for. They decided to stand for everything progressive. They decided to attack the Klan wherever possible. They decided to stand up for ethics in state government and local governments. They decided to demand that religion not be allowed to overwhelm scientific knowledge. They opposed prohibition. They stood up against injustices against blacks. They opposed lynching. You get the idea. It was pretty much a broad-based progressive agenda. And the very first part of this progressive agenda, of course, was the campaign against the Klan. And so when we start talking about the campaign against the Klan, the very first thing that happened was that the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, did a really major expose of the Klan. And the Harrises sort of waited, Harris and Loyalists sort of waited to see if any other newspaper in Georgia would pick up that series of articles that the World was running, the expose of the Klan, and no other Georgia newspaper did. And so because of this, Harris and Loyalists decided to bring the series of articles to the Columbus Inquirer-Sun. And it's interesting because the impact of the series of articles in Columbus was not as overwhelmingly positively received as it was elsewhere. Columbus was very traditional. Columbus was a cotton mill town. It had a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan that met in the city armory. It had many of the public officials who were members of the Klan at that time. And so we have things that would, during that period of time, events would happen that would attempt to dissuade the Inquirer-Sun from running the series of articles about the Klan. One story was that someone dumped sand in the printing presses of the Inquirer-Sun and sort of brought to a halt publication for a while. Another story goes that there was a bomb threat against the Columbus Inquirer-Sun. Another story goes that there was marchers, Klansmen marching outside the Columbus Inquirer-Sun, complete with hoods, masks, and some of whom were on horseback. The story there goes that Harris and Loyalists both rushed out into the midst of this group of Klansmen, and I presume in some cases must have recognized who they were even with a hood on, but in other cases pretended to recognize who they were and told them their name would be in the next day's newspaper. And that seemed to have had sort of an effect of dissuading the Klan from doing too much more along the threatening way to them. The threats after that tended to be threats by letter and threats sort of a couple of times removed. In other words, threats that were not directly at them themselves, but that others around. As an example, they became frightened enough, however, that when they walked home each night to their apartment, that they actually hired bodyguards to go with them to make sure that the Klansmen were not there lying in wait. During this particular time period also, there was this series of events that dealt with the new city manager. Columbus had just adopted a new city manager form of government, and the city manager was brought in from Pennsylvania, and he was going to clean up the town. He was going to make the budget work. He was going to do everything like this. But apparently one night the Klansmen did have the temerity to attack the city manager on his way home, to club him from behind, and that was it. He left town shortly thereafter and never came back. And again, the Harrises attributed this to the Klan, although again, nobody ever really specifically took credit, and it wasn't really clear who was responsible for this. The bottom line is that throughout these first couple of years, from 1920 through 1922 into 1923, the Columbus Inquirer was competing against the afternoon newspaper, the Columbus Ledger, and the Columbus Ledger had a circulation during that period of time of about 11,000. And the Columbus Inquirer started off with a circulation in the 1920s of about 5,000. And throughout this period of time, they found that as things like this happened, people would discontinue their subscription, then they would pick it back up, something else would happen, they'd quit again, and they'd pick it back up. And so there have been scholars who've sort of said that the Columbus Inquirer's circulation figures were like a kaleidoscope during that period, that they were fluctuating broadly. For the most part, in 1923, there really wasn't much left. I mean, once you sort of get past these things and Klan activities begin to die down. So Harris began writing about Klan activities throughout the remainder of the state. So when incidents were reported, he made certain that it got coverage here. And in 1924, really the last big event that the Harrises and Harrison loyalists were involved in happens involving Georgia's governor, Governor Walker, at that particular time. Now, before this happens, at about the same time, what we're finding also is that Thomas Loyalist is having financial difficulties himself. I mean, he owns half interest in the Columbus paper, is not making any money to speak of. He owns interest in this hotel in Warm Springs, and so it's not unexpected that as Julian Harris tries to sell advertising, and advertising doesn't sell easily in a town that doesn't have a big circulation, Loyalist is finding himself squeezed. And sooner or later, in the 1923, 1924, Harris and Loyalist finally have a break. And Harris buys out Loyalist's interest in the Columbus Inquirer-Sun, and Harris becomes editor and publisher at that particular point. Now, like I said a minute ago, the challenge, or one of the events involving the Klan in 1924 was that there's a big Klan convention. And the big Klan convention, I think my memory is correct, was in Kansas City. And the publicity arm of the Ku Klux Klan never said who was going to be there or who was going to speak. All they simply said was that the keynote speaker was going to be the governor of a great state. And at that time, Governor Walker, who was governor of Georgia, decides to take a vacation and gives the governor's office information about his itinerary, and is supposed to go to Pennsylvania or New York or somewhere in the Northeast to enjoy some of the scenery and some of the cooler weather and such. And at the same time, we have this convention going on out in Kansas City about the Klan, and the coverage is just immense because everybody wants to hear what the Klan has to say. When the convention was over, and we actually find that the keynote speech had been given, and Harris got a copy of the keynote speech, he ran across a phrase in that speech which he thought he recognized as a phrase that Governor Walker used regularly. And because he was so convinced that Governor Walker indeed must have been the keynote speaker of the Klan convention, he hired freelance writers and took his own Washington, D.C. correspondent, and they tracked the governor's travels. He's supposed to be going from Atlanta up northeast to Pennsylvania, wherever it was, and they tracked him, and they found out, no, he did not go there. And so their conclusion, once they actually had able to find a hotel reservation in Kansas City, was that yes, Governor Walker was the Klan keynote speaker at the convention, and Governor Walker was forced to acknowledge that he was indeed a Klansman. Because he did not want to take the fall by himself, he insisted that several others, and he forced several other state officials to acknowledge that they were Klansmen also, including the agriculture department head and some others. And so Harris really was vindicated. He had really sort of done this investigation. But what's interesting with regard to the story of the Pulitzer Prize is that for 1925, because the Pulitzer Prize given in 1926 was for activities, for articles such published in 1925, for 1925, the Columbus Inquirer-Sun did not publish a lot of information or articles about the Ku Klux Klan. It was almost like the Klan had sort of ceased to be a threat, or not maybe not a threat, but maybe at least ceased to be the major player in Georgia politics that it needed to be. And so really in 1925, Harris and his wife picked another event that really got them in more trouble even than anything the Klan ever did. They decided to go to Dayton, Tennessee, and to cover individually, on site, the Scopes monkey trial. All right, in 1925, the Harrises were one of a small group of reporters who went to attend the Scopes monkey trial. The Scopes monkey trial, of course, was John Scopes, who was a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who acknowledged that he likely taught evolution, and that meant that he was prosecuted for teaching evolution in public schools. The ACLU came to sort of support him. Clarence Darrow was his defense attorney, and William Jennings Bryan assisted the prosecution. This became a major spectacle in the summer of 1925. The Harrises were in Dayton because they felt like that it was a classic example of the threat that religion posed to science, and they were there to support science. They were not the only reporters from Georgia to attend the monkey trial. There was one other, a woman by the name of Mildred Seidel, who wrote for the Atlanta Georgian. And Mildred Seidel was a person who wanted to be a columnist. And her way of doing this and the way of talking the Georgian into letting her go was that she claimed to be able to look at a person's hand, not the palm, but the shape of the person's hand, and to ascertain what level of intelligence was evident in the individual. And so you might imagine when you start thinking of William Randolph Hearst, who owned the Atlanta Georgian, and this sort of nice little sort of gimmick, if you will, why not let her go to Dayton, Tennessee? Why not let her interview the judge and all the people she can find and have them holding up their hand to talk about what their level of intelligence was? And then, of course, to have the picture of an ape's hand, and then to talk about how that worked out. She loved it. This was great for her. She comes back to Atlanta and gets the columnist position she wanted. The Harrises were there for a little different purpose. Their aim was to show how horribly religion treated evolution. And there was plenty of examples of that. Now, we should note, just for the record, that Julian Harris was raised Catholic. His parents attended the Catholic Church, and he did too. And he went to confession regularly until, in his words, he found out he was making up sins to confess, and he quit. Now, there's a certain interesting concept about realizing you're making up sins to confess, and Harris has a little bit of an ego associated with that also. Mrs. Harris grew up as a Methodist, and she decided at some point that there was so much bigotry in the pulpit that she could not attend church any longer. And yet both of the Harrises considered themselves to be Christians and considered religion to be an important part of their life. If I may, I want to read you a quote here. Julia wrote a friend of hers, and she said, "For many years, so-called religion has been perfectly meaningless to me, and the absurdities and actual hypocrisies which Orthodox preachers proclaim from the pulpit every Sunday are so insulting to my intelligence and my love of truth that I have come to have a dislike for the term. One only has to read all the Gospels to realize how very far, Orthodox religion has departed from the Spirit of Christ. That is why I cannot be a church member. I realize it is a seeming paradox to say I am not a member of any church because I believe literally in the message of Jesus, but such is the fact." So you get sort of the feel here that the Harrises had a definite perspective on religion. They believed in religion. They believed in freedom of religion. They considered themselves religious. They did not consider themselves to fit within the religious tradition, if you will, of any of the churches in Columbus. And that has to have hurt them somewhat, because if you think of any time you move, certainly back then, to a small town, one of the ways a businessman sort of makes himself known to the people of the town is to choose a church to attend and become known that way. The Harrises did not. The Harrises in Dayton, Tennessee became fast friends with Clarence Darrow, became fast friends with H.L. Mencken, just despised and rejected and wrote terrible things about William Jennings Bryan. And throughout the week-long trial, Julian Harris would write the news stories about the trial, And Mrs. Harris would write sort of the feature stories about the trial. And they would each find different things. And so one night they go to a Holy Roller meeting and they write their impressions of seeing Holy Rollers as a religious group worshiping. Another time they talk about the population of Tennessee and how Tennessee at that time was a much more religious state than many other states were. They talk all sorts of things, but what's interesting is that they understand it's a lost cause. Everybody assumes that Scopes is going to lose and he'll be convicted. This is not at all a surprise to anyone. And so when it happens, they come back to Georgia and they're very proud of what they've done, but they also don't realize how much Georgians hated what they did. They got all sorts of hate mail, all sorts of letters, including one from a woman who said, you seem to think that by acting the way you are that you come across as very intelligent, but you don't. The Harrises claim that they refused to talk down to their audience. And that's true, but there's also an element here in which by not talking down, they talked down, they put them down. And so they were not very popular for this particular crusade. The year of 1925, and this is the year that Harris submitted a group of editorials to the Pulitzer Committee for its consideration, Julian Harris entered two categories. He entered the editorial writing category, and he also entered the public service category. And the editorial writing category committee recommended that Julian Harris be awarded the editorial writing Pulitzer Prize for 1926. The other committee, the Public Service Committee, also recommended that Harris and the Columbus Inquirer-Sun be awarded the Public Service Pulitzer Prize for 1926. And because the Pulitzer Committee did not wish to give any single newspaper or journalist two awards for the same body of work, Harris and the Columbus Inquirer-Sun were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, and Edward Kingsbury of the New York Times won the editorial writing award from 1925 for 1926. Now, this should have been the high point, and yet it was not, because the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service brings with it a certificate and a gold medal. Every other category of the Pulitzer Prize brings with it a certificate and a check. And Harris, who really probably could seriously have used the money because his circulation was still, like a kaleidoscope here, finds himself with a gold medal that he couldn't really do anything with except be proud of. And he was proud of it. He was very, very pleased with what he did and everything. But shortly thereafter, there were a couple of events that sort of gets him into all sorts of trouble. But before I get to that point, let me back up just a second and want to remind you of Harris's philosophy, okay? Because he has an editor friend of his who writes him a letter that really sort of summarizes Harris's journalistic philosophy, and I'm just going to read it right fast. The letter writer says, "The antics and attitudes you assail afflict us down here too, and we do our best to damn them, but the frontal attack stink bomb method you use would get us into endless trouble." And so the best way I've come to describe Harris's journalistic style is what the letter writer says, the frontal attack stink bomb method. And Harris specialized in that particular method. One of the editorials he wrote on the last day of 1925, December 31st, 1925, that he included in his submission to the Pulitzer Committee was titled, "Look Forward, O Georgia." And I'm going to read parts of it here for you. For many months, we have been hearing these empty words, "It's great to be a Georgian." And the echo of this meaningless phrase, repeated with monotonous insistence, has found its easy way into so many Georgia newspapers that there are literally hundreds of thousands of Georgians who believe that it's great to be a Georgian. No questions are asked by this vast, unthinking majority of Georgians, and the how and why of mediocrity or of the minority, which wants to discover the reasons for this parrot spoken phrase, are lost to the ear. Is it great to be a Georgian? Is it great to be the son or daughter of a state which seeks to cover its many shames with the unceasing utterances of an unmeaning slogan? Is it great to be the citizen of a state which endorsed the lynching of a prisoner and insulted and defamed a governor who as a man and leader stood and still stands head and shoulders above any person who assailed him? Is it great to be a citizen of a state which is the proud parent of a cowardly hooded order founded and fostered by men who have been proven liars, drunkards, blackmailers, and murderers? Is it great to be a citizen of a state whose governor is a member of and subservient to that vicious masked gang, and whose officials are either members or in sympathy with it? Is it great to be a citizen of a state where a mob openly lynches a lunatic and no effort is made to capture and condemn the murderers who committed this revolting crime? Is it great to be a citizen of a state which has a larger percentage of illiteracy and which spends less per capita for education than any other state in the Union? Is it great to be the citizen of such a state? Is it great to be a Georgian? Let each one answer as he will, but the reply of the Enquirer son is no. That's pretty powerful. That is frontal attack, stink bomb method journalism, I would say, at its best or worst. I'll let you choose what particularly that means. But you get the idea that Harris really did believe in not pulling punches. He was not subtle. He was kind to friends, but he was not kind to anyone that he considered in opposition to what he's trying to accomplish here. And so we have a national award, the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, given to a newspaper and to a newspaper editor who really had a no-holds-barred attitude of journalism. And no-holds-barred attitude of journalism did not sit well in Georgia. Georgia had some newspapers that were progressive, but overall, it was a little like the accusation of somebody soiling their own nest. So if you're going to make fun of your own people, if you're going to diminish or demean your own state, is this a place that you should live? Maybe some people suggested Harris should go to New York and live elsewhere. And so things quieted down after the Pulitzer Prize was announced. It was really great fanfare. Even the Columbus Ledger, the afternoon paper with which Harris had so many disagreements, congratulated the Harrises. But shortly thereafter, there were two magazine articles that appeared about the Harrises. And these two magazine articles painted Columbus in a totally and completely unflattering light, painted Harris in a totally, completely flattering light, and therefore set Harris at odds with all of his readers and subscribers once again. Harris got tired of trying to defend himself and so quit defending himself. What he did is that he reprinted each of these articles, each of these magazine articles in his newspaper, and then he printed every letter that he received. Well, you might imagine that without some sort of defense, it really becomes an overwhelming massacre. Readers throughout Georgia, editors, people who you might have thought admired Harris, none of whom did. They all were belligerent, they all were caustic, they all complained, they all criticized Harris for allowing his reputation, that of his newspaper, for allowing his efforts to be painted in such a way that they appeared to be so crass and they appeared to be so unworthy of the time-honored calling of being a journalist. And so Harris finds himself at the end of 1926, again, without having done anything at all, being in some cases praised, but the praise was coming from further and further away, and then at home, roundly criticized. Beyond this, we find that through 1926, through 27, and through 28, Harris finds himself in increasingly dire financial circumstances. And the financial circumstances were basically that as the Roaring Twenties progressed, we all know that the American economy was not in great shape, and that we were heading toward what we now know to be called Black Friday in 1929, which is the date the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. Harris in 1929 finally realized he could not publish his newspaper any longer. He had to have some financial assistance from elsewhere. And so he sold part interest in his newspaper to an outside journalist from Texas. And he and Miss Harris took a long overdue vacation. When they came back, they found out that their co-owner had changed things completely, that he had fired columnists, that he had changed coverage, that he moved things around, and that the Enquirer-Sun was not the crusading paper it had been when the Harrises left town. The Harrises tried to sort of put up with these series of indignities for a while, finally concluded that they could not, and at the end of 1929, in a very open and public break with the new co-owner, quit. And so the Harrises, their decade in Columbus is over at that time, and they moved back to Atlanta with no job, no prospects, and right at the actual beginning of the Great Depression. By this time, however, they had made some people who were admirers. They had some editors and publishers elsewhere who admired them, one of whom was the owner and publisher of the New York Times. And the New York Times at that point also owned a newspaper in Chattanooga, which was the Chattanooga Times. And so they appointed Harris to be the new editor of the Chattanooga Times. He lasted about 5 years, from 30 to 36, 37. He took the same attitude there that he took in Columbus, and was somewhat surprised to find that he was not praised by anybody, that the mayor confronted him, the city government confronted him, others confronted him, and as a matter of fact, even the ownership of the New York Times suggested that he might be better if he toned it down just a little bit. He couldn't, that was not Julian Harris. And in about 1935, he retires from the newspaper business for good. In 1935, the New York Times, he moves back to Atlanta, and the New York Times allows him to write an occasional column for the New York Times. And the occasional column would be on whatever he wants to. He'd be sort of the Southern correspondent, as it were. And throughout the rest of that time, he ends up, we're talking, he and his wife are in old age. They have a lot of nieces and nephews around, but they have no family of their own because both their sons died very young. And throughout the 1950s, we find that journalism and civil rights increasingly sort of left the Harrises behind, that they were not near the progressives they were back in the 1920s. They finally moved into nursing homes in the early 1960s, and there Julian Harris died in 1963, and Julia died in 1967. But before they did this, they went through all their personal papers, all the letters, all the newspaper clippings, everything they had, and they edited them. You would find, especially when I did my research in the Harris papers at Emory, you'll find handwritten notes of either Julian Harris or Mrs. Harris all through different letters and papers and such, and they'd write their response to this type of thing. In some ways, it made for an interesting research, because you could see the original letter that was written, or you could see the article that was written, and then you could sort of hear years later what they were thinking about it when they were preparing to give the papers to Emory. Again, they gave not just the papers to Emory, but they also gave the Pulitzer Gold Medal and the certificate. And so the answer to the question that my father asked me all those years ago about did I know that the Columbus Enquirer had won the Pulitzer Prize, the answer is no, because there was no certificate on the wall of the newspapers like there was for the Columbus Ledger when I was a kid there. There was no gold medal on display, because it is now on display at Emory University. The Columbus Ledger in 1955 won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for its campaign against corruption and lawlessness in neighboring Phoenix City. Now, if you know anything about the geography of Georgia, you know that Columbus is on the Chattahoochee River, about halfway down Georgia, and exactly on the opposite shore is Phoenix City, Alabama. Now, there was a couple of other cities around there, but Phoenix City is the main city. Phoenix City became sort of the opposite of Columbus, Georgia, and by that I mean that Columbus was trying to be progressive, trying to be law-abiding. Phoenix City gained a reputation as not just a corrupt city, but a really corrupt city, a lawless city, a city of gangs, of people who were taking bribes and all these different sorts of things. The story goes that Phoenix City across the river from Columbus and some of its neighboring towns became known locally as Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you get the idea that Phoenix City was not well respected during that particular period of time. Another story goes that one time many of the soldiers at Fort Benning, which is just south of Columbus, would always go to Phoenix City for gambling and for prostitution and those types of things that they were not able to get in Columbus. And the story says that one of the soldiers was arrested and put into the local Phoenix City jail, and that General George Patton, once he found out about this, took a tank, drove it across the river, and got his soldier out of jail. Phoenix City really was known as a respite place for soldiers. It was considered to be a playground, and I'll use that word very, very loosely. Really, things came to a head when Phoenix City elected, I believe, a district attorney whose aim it was to clean up Phoenix City. Unfortunately, the district attorney was assassinated, and at that point, the government, the state of Alabama, took over and sent in troops and sent in other investigators in an effort to clean up Phoenix City. And the story behind what's called the Phoenix City cleanup is the story for which the Columbus Ledger won the Pulitzer Prize back in 1955. And again, it was largely this idea of trying to bring municipal government into ethics and integrity and all those things that Phoenix City did not have. There was at one time, in one of my favorite B movies of all time, it was about late 1950s, I believe it was, a movie called The Phoenix City Story, which is supposed to have told fictionally the story of the Phoenix City corruption and the Phoenix City cleanup. My father, his name was Carol Lisby, was a early new reporter on the Columbus Ledger at that time, and matter of fact got his job on the Columbus Ledger because he was in Decatur, Alabama, and had heard something about who the new appointment was going to be to run the Phoenix City cleanup, and calls the Columbus Ledger to let them know about it. He helped them scoop the official release of the information, and they offered him a job as a result of this, and he spent most of his professional career as editor of the Columbus Ledger.